Nobody was really speaking out against this creeping ideology that was becoming so normalised. I think I used the phrase back in 2009, we are sleepwalking into a nightmare, and look what happened.
Hello and welcome to Wake Up Investigates with me, Sonia Poulton, journalist, broadcaster and generally recognised as an all-round troublemaker, and frankly so much the better for it. Today I want to look at the whole phenomenon of transgenderism, and particularly as it pertains to the UK. In December 2015, I started a journey that would bring me 10 years later to here. I was invited onto LBC Radio to have a conversation with another guest. Nothing unusual with that. I am a long-time media commentator, and alongside my work as a journalist and broadcaster, I've spent decades on TV and radio arguing about one social issue or another. What was unusual this time was I was introduced to a new concept that I struggled to get my head around. My opponent was a woman called Susie Green, and she was involved with a British organisation called Mermaids, which was described to me by the researcher as a charity that helped children who were confused about their gender. Well, I thought, what was unusual about that? Many children become confused about their gender at one stage or another because society has put impossible stereotypes on the backs of people and expected us to fit them like a one-size-fits-all. Well, many don't. Anyway, it turned out Susie was an extremist. She had taken her 16-year-old son out of the country and come back, at least in her mind, with a daughter. She had permitted an operation on her child that involved going to Thailand to get it done. Susie's story would later be romanticised into a docu-drama by broadcasters ITV. Butterfly, as it was called, was advised by Mrs. Green and was part of the intense promotion the channel gave to the notion of trans children. In fact, and more about this later, I worked on ITV for over a decade, and the last time I had a job there was when I came out criticising the trans lobby and how they were negatively impacting society. More about that shortly. But back to Susie, and on LBC in December 2015. Well, as a journalist who had covered all forms of child abuse, Susie and I, as you might imagine, clashed. During the show, I was reprimanded by the host for saying the Tavistock clinic had been conducting social experiments for decades and for calling my opponent a child abuser. I knew next to nothing about transgenderism, but I didn't need to in order to know that a mother who permitted their child to be butchered in such a way, which is how I viewed it then and still view it, is not someone that I would agree with. Perhaps that was why the radio producers decided to invite me on in the first place, probably. That encounter with Susie Green, albeit brief, left an impression on me. I consider her actions and behaviour to be abhorrent, and I hoped there weren't many Susie Greens in the world. Children want to be all manner of things, right? And some of the things they want to be are harmful. They don't necessarily know it's harmful because they may have been fed an idea that it's not, that it's something that will benefit them. Either way, it is up to the parents or carers, the adults in the room, to say no. Well, Susie wasn't a woman to say no. And unfortunately, as I was to discover, some of these parents didn't say no because they were actively living through their children. I've seen parents who insist their children are trans simply to garner attention for themselves. I've seen families on social media quite literally transing their children for likes, shares, and subscribes. I've seen celebrities, maybe running out of their own fame, suddenly present their transgender children to the world. So fickle and manipulated is our world. It seems to make that celebrity relevant once more. Yes, it's gruesome stuff. Parents of so-called trans children are problematic parents. No wonder their children are struggling. As far as my personal understanding about the transgender phenomenon went, fast forward from 2015 to 2017, when I encountered a video featuring Dr. Jordan Peterson. He was then a university professor in Canada, and he appeared to have fallen foul of his students. Peterson was pushing back against transgenderism and particularly the use of preferred pronouns. There was something disturbing and totalitarian about the pupils who were up in arms with him. They were extremely angry because he refused to call a man a woman and a woman a man, and the rage and indignation some of them displayed, frankly, alarmed me. I felt like they were under some sort of spell, unhinged even, and it seemed to be spreading at an alarming rate. Then I saw a video featuring a woman called Magdalen Berns, a British lesbian, now sadly dead, who was also pushing back against transgenderism, and in a way that I could relate to what she was saying. She was gutsy, she was profane, and she was absolutely spot on in her assessments. She didn't give one tinker's cuss what anyone thought of what she was saying, even though it was still early days and she was breaking new ground in pushing back, ground that was already more captured than many of us realised. Magdalen Berns was a co-founder of For Women Scotland, the group which has led a series of important challenges that have impacted this debate, including the recent Supreme Court judgment confirming that biological reality actually counts. Imagine that. So from Susie to Jordan to Magdalen, I began to immerse myself in the world of transgenderism and the pushback that was taking place in the UK, albeit the early doors. I watched famous feminist Germaine Greer being as bold as possible during an interview with the already captured BBC, and I took inspiration from her, even when the trans activists worked to get her cancelled. So, a little bit about my history. I am a 60s child, born into a hippie and somewhat mystical family, and I was long described as liberal. As a teen, I adored the new romantic era where men started to wear makeup better than many women, and people became sick and tired of gender conformity, including me. I was a London clubber in the 80s when androgyny and dressing up was a big thing. I had gay male friends who I called girlfriend, and I supported the gay charity Stonewall. I was as embracing as a left-wing British woman could possibly be. I loved this time in my history. Along the way, I met several transsexual men who were unhappy with the accoutrements of being male and had had surgery to remove any parts they no longer desired. I didn't judge them. I believed pretty much in live and let live until several decades later when I was asked to appear on that radio show with Susie Green, and that was when I had a change of perspective. As an investigative journalist who had spent years reporting on the abuse of children, I was horrified to discover that children were literally being told they were born in the wrong body, and all they had to do was accept that nature had made a mistake, and by the magic of the pharmaceutical and surgical industries, that could all be rectified. I was shocked. Surely this was illegal. Apparently not. But I was in no doubt at all that what Susie Green had told me was child abuse. And so back in 2019, I decided to start documenting this new phenomenon. And what I'm doing today is I am condensing the voices of over 40 people that I directly talked with to gain my understanding of what was going on. Over 40 contributors, including parents, psychiatrists, academics, lawyers, politicians, activists, lords, and the people at the heart of this story, trans people themselves. I want to thank each and every person who has informed me along the way. What I have actually ultimately captured requires more than this one-off investigation. And that is the plan for the future. As you can imagine, such a documentary proposition to broadcasters has been problematic, to say the least. It was just way too far ahead of the curve. I was told repeatedly that questioning the trans narrative was not the direction the editors wished to go. But things have changed in the UK in the last year. The trans grip has been ungripped. And so eventually we intend to put a several part documentary out, and preferably on one of the big streaming services. The world and some commissioning editors, thank goodness, have finally caught up in a way that they hadn't, and it hadn't previously. I had deep concerns about what could be the core psychological issues driving transgenderism in the UK. And so I set out to explore more. What do the psychological and medical experts think we have here? To me, it's evidently a mental health issue, and I don't say that in any pejorative way. I am interested in the way minds work, and I studied for a psychology degree in my 40s because I wanted to better understand myself and others. With transgenderism, it seemed evident to me that we were dealing with some kind of mental scenario. You don't need to have studied the mind or the body to know it makes no sense to hate who you are so much that you would be willing to subject yourself to social isolation, public ridicule, surgery, and a lifetime of pharmaceutical drugs, just for starters. We are told that people who call themselves transgender are suffering from a condition called gender dysphoria. What is it? I talked with Brighton-based Bob Withers, a training analyst with the Society of Analytical Psychology with 35 years clinical experience as an analytical psychotherapist and 25 years as a clinical supervisor. This is what he had to say.
So I would conceptualize it as a mismatch between a person's mind and body. There's a myth out there on the internet put forward by certain organisations, perhaps I shouldn't name them, but they put this myth out that there's a biological basis to gender dysphoria, and at the moment there isn't any known biological basis. On the other hand, this mismatch between mind and body has been studied psychotherapeutically for a long time.
Brighton, in some respects, is the epicentre of transgenderism in the UK, and the recent Pride Parade was considered big enough to host superstar Mariah Carey. Over the last few years, there have been two behemoths driving this. This is Stonewall, the legendary lesbian and gay charity in Clerkenwell, South East London. And this is the Gender Identity Clinic at the Tavistock Centre in North London. Over the last year or so, both of these organisations have witnessed a supreme fall from grace, and it continues. The Tavistock's Gender Identity Clinic has been obliterated due to campaigners, whistleblowers and lawsuits, and Stonewall, which spread toxic tentacles into every area of public life, including the government and the education department, financial institutions and banking, and even all over the Football Premier League, has lost its grip. And organisations are cancelling membership of the Stonewall scheme, which rewarded people and companies with virtue signalling points for being good allies. There are other organisations that have been involved, and many publicly funded, but these two organisations have, in my understanding, done the most damage and must be held to account. At the heart of many of the troubles that were being experienced by men, women and children, the famous groundbreaking charity that I had formerly supported and under the direction of Ruth Hunt betrayed lesbians and gays. Hunt was pictured at a garden party with ally PM Theresa May, and when Hunt left Stonewall, she was given a place in the House of Lords, despite, in the opinion of many lesbians and gays, making life worse for them than before. In fact, in 2019, I was at the inaugural meeting of LGB Alliance, which was formed as a direct consequence of lesbians, gays and bisexual people having a problem with Stonewall's stance. Many lesbians and gays have formed part of the pushback against gender ideology, including actor James Dreyfus, most famous perhaps for starring in the movie Notting Hill and the TV show Gimme, Gimme, Gimme. But James is a talented actor who simply could not ignore what he was being told about his sexuality. I also talked with Simon Fanshawe, a co-founder of Stonewall UK, who was deeply concerned.
I tried a lot of private ways of trying to reach people who I thought were driving this debate, and they rebuffed us. And in the end, I thought, well, there's nothing for it but to go public and say there needs to be a debate.
It was really sad to see Stonewall go from hero to zero in my lifetime. The divisive and betraying role of Stonewall in all of this should not be underestimated and indeed never forgotten. What was once a proud charity leading the way on issues concerning lesbians, gays and bi people became a totalitarian boot-stomping threat for women, children, and ironically, the very people the charity had been set up for. The problem is Stonewall was now operating under this thing called the transgender umbrella. It was all inclusive, from spicy straights to straight out fetishes. It was for everyone and no one. Under that umbrella, they had even used intersex people in an attempt to further the cause, but those dealing with the condition were not impressed.
So they're using it to show that, or to try to pretend to show that that we don't know what biological sex is and that we can't classify people as male or female. So what they do is they use intersex conditions to create a spectrum of sex that says that we're not male or female and therefore we don't know who male and female people are. I think that sums it up.
The people that come out of this best of all are of course governments who don't really change, and the corporations and the charities that prey on these corporations. So we have groups like Mermaids and Stonewall who, if they were doing their job properly, would suddenly have nothing to campaign for, because the mark of a successful campaigning organisation is that their campaign is no longer needed. But Stonewall, of course, they ran out of track.
During the period, I was observing the trans lobby and how it was impacting the UK. The issue of a consultation to reform the Gender Recognition Act was introduced, and the public were invited to contribute to the consultation. Campaigners, including campaigning politicians, wanted to introduce self-ID, meaning a man could call himself a woman and a woman could call herself a man, and without all the checks and balances that were required to obtain a gender recognition certificate. Either way, the whole thing was, of course, a legal fiction, as it was not possible to actually change sex. But this had all come about as a consequence of a transsexual. In 2004, Christine Goodwin took the UK to court. Goodwin's argument as a trans-identified male was he wasn't able to marry his male partner because in law he was regarded as a man despite the transition. Goodwin was also affected at work, and there was a whole raft of problems that British law couldn't accommodate a man who thought he was in the wrong body. Goodwin argued that Article 8 was in breach. This is a person's right to a private and family life, and the court agreed. What followed was the UK government had this big conversation about what to do, and instead of introducing same-sex marriage, which they did later, they introduced the Gender Recognition Act, which enabled people to change all documents from male to female or female to male if they could show they had been living in their acquired gender and were diagnosed as having gender dysphoria. Here is an example of the bias that many people brought to the debate. This is Penny Mordaunt, friend of Bill Gates, and recently seen at the King's coronation doing this. At the time, she was laughingly referred to as the Minister for Women and Equalities, but in reality, she was a trans activist. This is what she said from the dispatch box on the 3rd of July 2018, introducing the government's consultation on proposals to reform the Gender Recognition Act.
As I said in my speech this morning, trans women are women. Trans men are men, and that is the starting point for the GRA consultation, and it will be its finishing point too. So I think we need to give very strong messages on that front, and I thank the Honourable Lady for affording me the opportunity to do that.
Absolutely outrageous. What a betrayal from a woman who was supposed to be in charge of the Office for Women and Equalities. And despite huge celebrity and political support, even Google got behind it. Self-ID failed to come into law in England and Wales. And the recent Supreme Court ruling involving a claim by the group For Women Scotland ruled that in law, the meaning women must be based on biology. This is so absurd that we need a court ruling to tell us what is already in the Equality Act. This has led to many advocates calling for a repeal of the Gender Recognition Act, arguing that it is no longer needed as same-sex marriage is now legal in the UK. Far from being a so-called civil rights movement, I discovered there were numerous areas of other people's lives that were impacted by transgenderism, and none more so than children. I have long covered the issue of child safeguarding and sexualisation, and I could see there were overlaps with so-called trans children. I was also concerned that the leading child safety charity, the NSPCC, was an organisation that promoted trans issues to children and had brought in at least one high-profile trans-identified male who had shown himself to be a man of poor judgment, who had publicly fashioned himself into a parody of a woman. So, realising that NSPCC could not help me, let alone the poor children that they were supposed to be safeguarding, and given they were already captured by the trans lobby and were trotting out queer mantras as if they were going out of fashion, I turned to more alternative voices, and I started to talk with people who did understand what was truly going on.
I'm Stephanie DAVIES-ARAI, and I'm the founder of Transgender Trend, which is the website I set up in order to give parents a resource of fact-based information based on proper evidence and science to as an alternative to the information that they were getting online, which was exclusively from transgender support groups. It was also to give parents a sort of forum, somewhere that they could contact, and also actually to get a voice into the media, because I noticed with stories of happy transgender kids and their supportive parents, there was never any voice to challenge that, and I felt it was important that that story was challenged in the media.
Stephanie was awarded the British Empire Medal in 2022 for services to children, and I watched as she became a formidable campaigner on behalf of children and concerned parents, and I filmed her on numerous occasions, including when she was giving talks, in interview, and when I went to her home. How do you feel when you hear that children are being told they're born in the wrong body?
I think that's a quite unbelievable thing to tell a child, to even suggest that that is possible to a child. A child that's thinking about before puberty, a child has no understanding and cannot have any understanding of what that means to be a girl born in a boy's body. Well, one, that's a biological impossibility, but to feel that their real, true, authentic self is somewhere in their head and completely unattached to the body. What that does is it gives the child a conception of themselves as disassociated from the body, as split off from the body, and then the body becomes meaningless or has no value. And once you take away the value of a child's body, then the body loses protection and a child is put at risk. What we normally do with children is try to help them to take care of their bodies, to respect their bodies, to respect other people's bodies, to respect boundaries between bodies. And if we take away the meaning of the body, then we take away protection for children.
It was absolutely clear to me that Transgender Trend were providing an important counterbalance to the gender charities that were flooding into British schools. How do you feel about the influence of mermaids in schools, etc.?
I think it's had a hugely damaging effect for children and for families. That what it's done, and that kind of teaching in schools, and that message that we must affirm. So a little boy who says, I'm a girl, I was born a girl, God made a mistake. That we must respond by affirming that identity. So basically we're saying, you're right, you were born a girl, your male body is an illusion, or it's not a boy's body, it's a girl's body, or whatever way we try and explain that to a child. You're giving them information which they cannot possibly understand, and it's the most extreme reaction you could give to a child. If a child, for example, says I'm fat and they're not, you would never validate that and say, yes, you're fat.
I was shocked by mermaids and what they were allowed to get away with, and all under the banner of affirming what a child wants. And I was also shocked to discover that Susie Green had a great deal of support, including celebrity and royal support, and had been at a Buckingham Palace party where Prince Harry had praised her for being an inspiration. It was evident to me that child safeguarding had gone out of the window regarding the issue of transgenderism. It was impacting all over areas of children's lives, including in social clubs and the girl guides. This is what Helen Watts, who was once a girl guide leader until she was pushed out for voicing her concerns, this is what she had to say.
This was initially brought to my attention when Girl Guiding announced that they had a new equality and diversity policy. In fact, it wasn't so much announced, it sort of slipped out in an email in late 2017. And actually the email to leaders didn't even spell out what the changes were. It was just, here's an update, here's a link to it, and then moved on to the next subject. The policy stated that Girl Guiding is a single gender organisation, not single sex, and that membership was based on the gender that a young person or adult self-identifies as. So anyone who self-identifies as a girl or woman may be a member, and anyone who self-identifies as something else. What really worried me was looking at the guidance for residentials. At the time I was a leader and I had been running overnights, sleepovers for Rainbows, and I noticed in the guidance that it was quite clearly stated that accommodation for overnight trips, changing facilities, toilets, washing facilities should be allocated on the basis of that gender self-identification and not according to biological sex.
For 6 years, little girls at Girl Guides were forced to share with little boys who believed, or their parents believed, that they were also little girls, but that changed this week. In December 2025, Girl Guides have been forced to return to its roots of biological girls only, but the organisation is distressed that the law is forcing it to do so. What an utter betrayal of the young girls it is supposed to educate and protect, and has completely failed. One of the huge myths that we've often heard is if we don't trans children, they will harm themselves. This is absolutely a myth that has been put out by organisations like Mermaids. And I talked to the experts about this. And one of the people that I talked to was Ray Blanchard, a Canadian American sexologist. And this is what he had to say about suicide stats.
Well, they're based on very shaky and unrepresentative data, and I think they're being used as emotional blackmail. They're primarily being used as emotional blackmail against parents of teenagers who became gender dysphoric very abruptly, and in cases where the parents suspect that this is a social contagion phenomenon. And one way of blackmailing the parents into going along with this is to say, well, if you don't support your son or daughter in this, he or she will commit suicide, and that will be on your head.
And this is what Ray had to say about social contagion.
I think with regard to the teenage cases, with regard to the huge inflation in the number of teenage cases, I would say yes, that is caused by social contagion.
I think a lot of minors who go to counselors or gender therapists with gender confusion, it's often overlooked that they have abusive pasts or traumatic pasts or have experienced a death, something significant that would severely impact the trajectory of a child's life, is being completely overlooked because the therapists are so firm in their belief that this child is in the wrong body and that needs to be fixed. What this really means is that children with trauma, they're not being helped with the trauma, it's being overlooked, and it's something that they have to continue to deal with while they transition, which is ultimately the detriment of their mental health, obviously.
And so I was looking at the demographics, and it was absolutely apparent that there were two clear demographics who were transitioning: teenage girls and middle-aged men. The impact on young females troubled me deeply, and by 2018 it was looking dire. There had been a 4,500% increase in so-called rapid onset gender dysphoria in girls who had been referred to the gender identity clinics since 2010, while boys experienced a 1,150% increase. Clearly, these issues are very complicated, but we also cannot rule out the influence of mass media. And the BBC were responsible for one of the single worst pieces of trans propaganda that was pumped out to children. When they ran a show which first aired in 2014 and then was repeated, My Life, I Am Leo, which aired on CBBC, the BBC channel, aimed at children aged 6 to 12 years old. Leo was born a girl but worked to transition to being a boy. The documentary was so powerful it won a BAFTA, but it was also full of dangerous nonsense that has since been disproven. Perhaps most egregious was the involvement of Polly Carmichael, the director at GIDS, the Tavistock's Gender Identity Clinic. Following pressure from a young gender lobby in 2011, Dr. Carmichael began trialling puberty blockers before any research was concluded on them. First mistake. The clinic then lowered the prescription age of puberty blockers from 16 to 11, and Polly Carmichael appeared on I Am Leo, making the second mistake, and one where there is no saying how much damage her words have done in the years that followed. She gleefully told the young audience that taking puberty blockers was not an irreparable thing and would cause no harm to their young developing bodies. She said, the good thing is if you stop the injections, it's like pressing a start button and the body just carries on developing as it would if you hadn't taken the injection. But given there was a lack of long-term data into puberty blockers, how could she have known this? She couldn't. Psychotherapist Marcus Evans worked at the Tavistock for decades, as did his nurse wife, Sue.
I mean, we really are in the dark in terms of the lack of long-term research studies. You know, these are very serious medical interventions which have life-changing effects on these kids, and we really don't know what we're doing. So I think we need an external body to sort of oversee what we're doing in this area.
There is so much we don't know about what was taking place regarding young people and transgenderism, and it has not been helped by the political rush to normalise it. That includes the prevalence of autism. At one stage, 35% of young people referred to the Tavistock were on the autistic spectrum. Fast forward to the Health Secretary Wes Streeting announcing after a series of controversies that puberty blockers would be banned in 2024. Oh, how people rejoiced, but it was short-lived. It was certainly too good to be true. He then got behind a study where children would be the live experimentation for puberty blockers. As 2025 neared its close, many of us feared more than ever for the safety of our children in the hands of the gender lobby. A huge part of the pushback of transgenderism has come from women who have been deeply concerned not only about the impact on children, but on single-sex spaces. You see, when men claim to be women, they then want access to the spaces that are only for women, such as women's prisons, women's changing rooms, women's toilets, and women's sport. It is a given fact that the majority of alleged sexual attacks at Britain's public swimming pools, sports centres, and changing rooms occur in unisex changing rooms. These are realities. Feminist and journalist Julie Bindel first covered transsexualism and sex reassignment surgery in 2003 for a Sunday newspaper supplement.
And it wasn't until a few months later that I wrote a piece for the Guardian Weekend magazine, a column, in which I raged about a trans woman called Kimberly Nixon, who had sued one of the best organisations dealing with male violence on the planet, Vancouver Rape Relief. Because they didn't want him to directly counsel rape survivors, because he presented very clearly as a male to female trans person. And this was before Twitter, and it was before Facebook, but immediately that I published this piece, the listservs, as there were then, and message boards such as Ginger Beer for lesbians, that had masses of trans women on, just exploded and went berserk. But I did say in that column, I did say, look, you know, this cannot happen. We will lose all of our sex-based rights if we allow men to identify as women and then say that they have the right to work at rape crisis centres where women clearly want to see other women.
But other areas of women's spaces that were being impacted were women in prison. Kate Coleman formed Keep Prisons Single Sex. She was deeply disturbed that men claiming to be women were being put into the female prison estate.
The female prison estate in this country is not single sex. It is mixed sex, because certain male prisoners under certain sets of circumstances are able to apply to be transferred to the female prison estate, or even just allocated there right from the start of their sentence. Women in prison are some of the most vulnerable women and the vulnerable people in this country, with high rates of mental health problems, previous experience of domestic violence, sexual violence, very often at the hands of their male partners, traumatic brain injury, which I find very, very disturbing. In one recent study in Scotland, it was as high as 80% of women had had a significant brain injury. So yeah, it was motivated by that, you know, you've got this literally, obviously captive population of very vulnerable women, and they're having sometimes some of the most violent and sexually violent male prisoners housed with them, and they have no choice about that. And I just felt this has to stop.
Many people like to believe that this is a toxic debate, that women on the one side and trans activists on the other are all as bad as each other. But philosopher and feminist Jane Clare Jones, also based in Brighton, disputes the notion of a toxic debate in the way it is presented in legacy media and on social media.
My perception is not that. My perception is that there has been an intentional, strategic, preemptive silencing of at least half of the stakeholders. There are two sides involved in this. There are the needs of the trans community, and those needs are important and they need to be recognised. And then there are the ways in which some of the demands being made by the trans community intersect with women and women's rights and women's spaces. And women are a stakeholder in this conversation. And we have been consistently intimidated, erased, threatened, and shut out of the process. The trans rights movement has attempted to make civic, legislative changes to policy in civic institutions without allowing there to be any public reckoning, discussion about the way in which that impacts women, and women are stakeholders in this situation. If you attempt to make serious legislative changes that impact women and you refuse to even allow recognition, you will discover that women get very angry. And we're not angry because we hate you or because we have some kind of irrational fear or bigotry towards who you are as individuals. We are angry because you are attempting to change fundamental means of social organisation which have major impacts on women, and you're attempting to change the legal definition of the political and legal class to which we belong, and you are attempting to do all of it while disallowing any recognition that we have any interest in that whatsoever. And that is the most profound act of contempt I have ever seen in my life, and we're very upset about it. And I think to then go, it's got very toxic, I actually don't like. It is toxic. It's a really vicious debate in a lot of ways. There is an incredibly hyperbolic, violent rhetoric that has been projected towards women consistently over the last 7 or 8 years. There is a lot of emotional manipulation. There is a huge amount of emotional blackmail. Every time women try and express their interests, we're accused of hatred, we're accused of bigotry, we're told that people are going to kill themselves. It's coercive control on a mass scale. But to say it's toxic, there's something in framing it in that way that still kind of implies this. Everyone just needs to be nice, right? If people could just be nice, this problem would go away. No.
And sports too was also impacted. Terrible things were happening. Fallon Fox, a man, had brutally assaulted another woman. At one stage, most of the first places in sports were being taken up by males, mediocre males who were not doing well in male categories, but suddenly realised they could excel if they called themselves women and entered the female races. That is less of an issue now, but there are still organisations such as Parkrun that allow men into the female category. But back in 2019, when I first started cataloguing this, and when I was speaking to women, there was a huge problem about it. And it was an act of true rebellion to stand up and be counted. A brave soul to do this was Olympian Sharon Davies, who was deeply disturbed by males identifying as women in order to enter women's sports.
So I suppose another really big reason for me wanting to have a voice about this is that I have a daughter who's nearly 21 years of age. In fact, I have 3 kids and they're all sporty. And, you know, I've been involved in sport for 20 years as a competing athlete, 25 years for the BBC, so now 45 years I've been involved in elite sport. I understand what it takes to be an elite athlete. And I have a daughter who was an elite athlete. She competed for Great Britain and England on heptathlon. And I would be heartbroken if she lost her opportunities to win medals at major competitions because she was competing up against someone who physically had a benefit she could do nothing about.
So you have an added motivation for this as well. It's not just for making sure that women still get to compete, but also that your daughter gets to compete on a level playing field.
I come at it both as a sports person, I come at it as a BBC correspondent who's been involved in sport and is still involved in sport on the side of the pool, and I come at it as a parent. I just think we have to base all of our decisions on science and proper research. We be fair and we have humanity and we be kind to everybody out there, but we believe in fair play.
What was going on was a top-down process, and the pushback was coming from grassroots. There were a number of organisations that had come together to push back against the encroaching attacks on women's freedom. 3 of the women who put themselves out there and whose activism I very much enjoyed was and is Posey Parker, Venice Allen and Julia Long. All 3 women have that wonderful quality of not giving a stuff what other people thought about their campaigning on this issue. This was from an afternoon I spent with all 3 when they started off protesting outside a Stonewall conference to ending up along the South Bank and the endless promotion of gender ideology at one of the many theatres along there. Posey's merchandise, as one example, being a mainstay of spreading the message of what is a woman. Why, she is, of course, an adult human female.
It's more hateful and will receive more negative attention to wear an adult human female t-shirt than if you wore trans women are women.
Really, at the beginning, I thought if we could all just get off social media and into a real life space, then we could actually come up with a solution for these laws and for, you know, how society in general deals with this idea of trans rights. But because of seeing how trans activists do not want a discussion and violently shut down any discussion that they can, it's made me realise that there is really no middle ground in this discussion. You either believe that trans women are women or you don't.
And Julia Long, an uncompromising lesbian who frankly has had no time for any male sensitivities around the issue and once gave a man a serious talking to when I was filming her.
I advocate
children consenting to sex.
about it, the fact it's actually happening. No, I'm advocating by taking pictures in front of
Yes,
people like
exactly.
that.
Well, you
should
be upset.
It's very upsetting. We're talking about it.
These pictures were all.
They're talking about it.
These
You're not
pictures.
talking about it.
We are talking about it. These pictures were all. Will you just shut the for a minute? I know you're obviously the type of man who doesn't listen to women, but you're going to have to listen for a little few seconds. These pictures have all been circulated with great celebration and glory on social media. So we didn't do that. We are drawing attention to what is happening. Now, if this is good enough to be done to children, it's good enough to be seen by children.
Venice, Julia, Posey have fought long and hard. They've helped regain the language that was being taken from us. Women were suddenly being reduced to all manner of awful names. And Venice Allen was put through absolute hell. She was subjected to a civil case. She was a member of Labour and they subjected her to an interrogation like they were the Stasi. There was activism in all form that was taking place. The resistors movement was fantastic, a grassroots movement of women around the country who were coming together and they began to produce imagery like this. And then there were the parents who were staging their own fight back against the trans lobby.
Hi, my name is Lily Maynard. That isn't actually my real name, but I chose a different name so that I could protect the identity of my daughter when I began writing about our experience when she thought she was transgender.
And when was that?
That would have been when she was 15 years old, so that would have been in 2015.
Single-sex spaces were impacting women all over, including in places like, for example, the Women's Only Pond in Hampstead, which was covered by the City of London. The City of London is a separate entity to the rest of London. It was becoming increasingly obvious that the reason many men had attached themselves to the notion that trans women are women is because it gave them an opportunity to give women a good kicking and make it look like they were part of a civil rights movement for the vulnerable. Here's what journalist Julie Bindel has to say about that.
This is plain old misogyny. It serves the misogynistic men and anti-feminist women very well to be able to scream transphobe and bigot and fascist at me and still be seen as progressive. It's a way to shut feminists up. It's a way to shut the likes of me up from talking about male violence. Some of the progressive men, like Owen Jones, etc., they really hate our type of feminism because we refuse to be subscribing to the feminism for men, the kind of slut marching and pole dancing and sex work being liberating for women. We cut through all of that bullshit and we talk about male violence, so it's perfect for them.
You know, I couldn't get my head around it a lot of the time. Why couldn't these virtue signalling, women hating men use their time to try and expand our understanding of what a man is rather than focusing on changing what a woman actually is? A lot of the time, these same issues did not arise, by the way, with females who are now identifying as males. They simply were not as forceful as males. And in a short moment, I will explain why. You know, no one was asking men to conform to macho, outdated stereotypes, but we weren't asking them to pretend they were women either. And that was where the problem came from. I never had a problem with men bucking gender conformity. It was only when I was being told that I must call men women and women men that I started to rail against it. And it was the same for many other people. But there was more. There were many safeguarding issues attached to it. It was also becoming apparent that there was a correlation between men who opposed women having their own spaces and sexual deviance. As one example, former MP Eric Joyce, he pleaded guilty in August 2020 after being caught with film of rapes of 7 children, including a 12-month-old baby. Eric seemed to think that single-sex spaces were nothing. And then there was election agent David Challoner, who I have covered in a separate report. He is the father of Amy Challoner, a trans-identified male who for a short period of time became a politician for the Greens and for the Lib Dems, and again, part of a report that I had covered. Well, election agent David Challoner is a piece of filth in every sense of the word. He was, in August 2018, he was sentenced to 22 years in prison. And these two men are far from alone. So yes, absolutely, there is a correlation between the type of men who insist that men can be women and should be allowed in female spaces, because what they want most of all is to get rid of the boundaries and barriers that protect women and girls from predators. As with everything, it was always important to follow the money. Journalist Jennifer Bilock was a leading authority on the issue of following the money. And she discovered that this was far from a grassroots campaign, but a top-down initiative pushed by billionaires, including the Pritzker family in the US. Jennifer Pritzker, a trans-identified male, was a former military man who fathered 3 children, but seemed to think he was a woman in his 60s. The Pritzkers have made a fortune from pharmaceuticals. But I was learning something else about the type of men who were claiming to be women. Far from being vulnerable, many of the men who were transitioning were from wealthy and middle-class backgrounds. I even had a 5 live debate once about a banker who chose to present as both a man and woman at work and had won awards. It was obvious that these were men because there was no way that women would have got away with some of the things that these trans-identified males did. Paris Lees, as one example, was highly celebrated, born male, had a conviction for violence, but ended up selling women's shampoo and being portrayed as a suffragette in Vogue. I never had a problem with transsexuals, a small group of people, primarily men, who relate to more commonly female ways and have often been physically castrated. But the thing is with transsexuals is they know they are a man. I figured, you know, it's their body, and as long as no one expected me to call a man a woman, there was no issue. But that was where trans differed. We were told a series of improbable things, that men could become women and vice versa. Logically, biologically, every way possible, I couldn't accept these things. They were patently a nonsense. And I had many problems with these ideas. The only ones who seemed to truly benefit were surgeons and big pharma. But I was starting to understand something else, a thing called autogynephilia. And I was fortunate to talk with the man who came up with the name. That is Ray Blanchard, an American-Canadian sexologist who has researched gender, identity, sexual orientation, and paedophilia. He realized there was a pattern he was seeing, and he coined the term autogynephilia.
I would say autogynephilic transsexualism is definitely not something new. I think it's been around since people, my suspicion is the very first publicized case of transsexualism, the one that was made into a movie, The Danish Girl. If you ever watched The Danish Girl, that individual had been married to a woman, and although obviously the movie was not motivated to go into psychological motivations like autogynephilia, and in fact I doubt that that's documented anywhere in the patient's history, your very first highly publicized transsexual was a married man. And certainly from the time I first started working at a gender identity clinic, which was 1980, lots of the biologically male patients came in with histories of sexual arousal with cross-dressing, and they had been married and they were fathers and husbands.
Right.
So it's nothing new. What I agree with you totally that something new is happening.
Yes.
But what's new that's happening is not that suddenly there are autogynephiles and before there weren't.
Understood. So what appears to be new that's happening is it's no longer, and this seems to be more apparent in male to female. So it's no longer seems to be okay to align with women. Now it's almost like a need to replace women. Have I got that right?
Well, some of the more spectacular things that have gotten into the media, more spectacular absurdities, have been pushed by male to female transsexuals. But female to males are not an entirely docile bunch.
That doesn't explain all men who prefer to present in a more feminine way. One such person is Fionn Orlando, whom I met on social media, someone we would have previously called a pretty male, an effeminate male, and who had struggled with the gender identity of a man. But Fionn also knew that he wasn't a woman.
I think my earliest memories of being dysphoria, of having dysphoria, it did strike about the time I was kind of learning to talk. So I suppose you learn gender as you learn language. And so one example that I can think of would be my mum getting me dressed in the morning, and she would say, "Oh, you're a cool dude." And I really didn't like that, because it was like, cool to me back in like early 90s was more like a masculine term. I remember being upset about that. It was like there was pretty girls and cool dudes, and it was like Bart Simpson kind of cool dude. So I just remember, no, mummy, I don't want to be a cool dude. The feeling of it arrived not because of the sexy stereotypes around me, but because I couldn't cross them. So it's like, you can't play with that toy. You're a boy, boys don't do this, boys don't do that, boys don't cry. You'll notice in documentaries and things, they always, when they're talking about a young gay child, they'll always say, "Oh, he was a sensitive boy." I was definitely a child that hid behind their mum's leg, and
Right.
No, and I remember I once took a doll with me. I must have been, 5 years old. No, I would have started primary school, I think. So I must have been like first year primary school. I took a doll with me to church, and there was another boy at my church who went to the same primary school, and like ever after that, I was called Dolly Boy.
Right.
At school. So it was just kind of like you got really shamed, and then instead of thinking these are just toys, you generally think, oh, I'm in the wrong body. Everything I like isn't in my access. You know what I mean? I'm not free to that. There must have been a mistake.
Then there was Debbie Hayton, a teacher who struggled with his gender and ended up getting breast implants, changing his name to Debbie, and now wearing his clothes as a woman. While Debbie preferred to use female spaces, Fionn continued to use male spaces.
Well, it's tricky because there is a conflict. As a trans woman, it's more comfortable for me to use female spaces, and well, it's more comfortable for me to use female spaces. But from your point of view, you don't know my motives, you don't know who I am or where I'm coming from. Different in a group of friends who will know me because they treat me as an individual. But in wider society, how do women know?
And to be clear here, as a journalist, I'm in no doubt whatsoever that media has been an all-out failure on the issue, calling violent men, some who murder, some who rape, describing them as she in the headlines, cancelling men and women who dared to speak out and pushing the trans affirmative narrative. Absolute failure of the media, no debate, censorship, free speech up in the air, and silencing people around asking questions was increasingly troubling to many people. The BBC, as we've discovered, was a big fat failure. And as a journalist, the issue of censorship and free speech around the issue alarmed me deeply. I became absolutely aware of how problematic it had become for people to voice their opinions. Many people were being cancelled and losing work. One man in particular was writer Graham Linehan, co-creator of the wonderful Father Ted. I'd watched Graham become an ally to women online and fight against the cult. And I met him in Camden, North London, at the offices of Hat-Trick Productions. He was writing the screenplay for Father Ted for the West End stage. We began filming him for the documentary, and then he stopped me. He was concerned that the production company would have a problem with us filming there. So we got in my car and we drove to a supermarket car park where I filmed him. This is what he had to say about getting involved in the first place.
I remember years and years ago hearing about Julie Bindel being no platformed, and to my shame, to my eternal shame, I thought there must be something in it. I thought she must have said something that was bigoted or transphobic, and then, you know, it was such an effective campaign of silencing her that I didn't actually hear what she really thought until years later, and I realized that, you know, again, she wasn't saying anything controversial. She wasn't saying anything transphobic or bigoted. It was just that the current ideology, the state that trans activism finds itself in at the moment, is very Puritan, very bullying, purist is the word. There's a kind of policing of people's thoughts, and you know, I began to see more and more examples of this playing out in different areas. The other thing I noticed was that scientists were being dissuaded from actually coming up with data that people could use on this issue, and that was a huge red flag for me, because I just thought that if they're actually trying to suppress accurate information, then something really bad is going on. So, you know, there were just a bunch of things that just kind of piled up, and after a while I just couldn't ignore them.
Some people have no dog in the race. They are not women, they are not children, they are not homosexual. Graham Linehan is a perfect example of that. He is none of those things, but he refuses to back down.
And I would not be bothered if any of this insane stuff was being kept within the confines of the internet, but it's not. It's leaking out into all these different places. Rape crisis centres being closed. Surely everyone can see how wrong that is. Surely they can see that women who've been raped cannot be in the same space as a male-bodied person when they're recovering from that rape. What the f*** is going on that people don't see that? Excuse my language. Sorry.
So what on earth is going on? We were told there was no debate. It didn't make sense.
Every ideology has its extreme ends, but this is one of the few areas where the extremists have been somehow placed in the mainstream.
And the more I found out about people being silenced, the louder I wanted to become. And it had the same impact on lots of other people. And people found their own ingenious ways to spread the message, including in hotbeds of trans activism like Goldsmiths in London and the famous gay village in Manchester. It was the activists who put themselves in front of the Pride Parade in 2019, a very brave thing to do that led to my last ever appearance on ITV's This Morning after 10 years being on the show. Let me explain. So on the Saturday at a Pride Parade in Manchester, activists from the group Get the L Out had positioned themselves at the front of the Pride Parade. And even though they are lesbians and it's supposed to be a parade that includes them, they were thrown out of the parade. I was incensed. It was evident the trans rights movements was primarily a man's rights movement, and it had no time for uppity females who dared to call it out. On the Monday, following these lesbians being ejected from Pride, I was invited onto This Morning, a popular mid-morning show in the UK. This was to discuss Marks and Spencer making rainbow sandwiches for Pride. Yes, you heard me right. That's the kind of dross that frequently passes for TV debates. As I looked at the hosts and at my opponent and at those sandwiches on the table, I just thought, I can't do this anymore. And I told a pile of home truths about Stonewall being homophobic and Pride being homophobic and trans being a culture where men were claiming to be lesbians and intending to force women to sleep with them, all backed by the so-called LGBT charity Stonewall. It was heady stuff for morning TV, and my appearance on the show that day would mark my absolute last. I had broken the golden rule. I had gone off script, and worse, I had told some serious home truths against the almighty Pride. At the time, This Morning was primarily ruled by two people. Host Philip Schofield was a major supporter of trans children and had a number of trans children on the show. He just recently come out as gay after decades of marriage. Schofield has since been forced to leave the show following revelations of an inappropriate relationship with a teenage lad who became a runner on the show. Schofield denied anything illegal taking place. His editor, Martin Frizzell, also a trans promoter, were not happy with me and what I had said on the show that morning, and they showed their disapproval by ensuring I didn't return. I didn't care. I had repeatedly said, Google the cotton ceiling, and it took the expression to the top of the Google charts that day and the next, and suddenly people were finding out that being trans was not the hearts and flowers that ITV had sought to portray it as. I was thrilled. My TV activism was absolutely worth it. The show, as we know, went into a downward spiral, and rumours of cover-ups and secrets involving inappropriate relationships enveloped it. Schofield and Frizzell are no longer there. Trans activists have benefited greatly from the idea of no debate and cancel culture, and those of us who spoke out have paid a price, but it has always been worth it. I have been cancelled from speaking engagements, TV shows, and there was even a petition to get me off Twitter. But the reality is, The whole trans issue has been a legal minefield. In the years that I've been conscious of the trans movement in the UK, the resulting fallout has become both criminal and civil. People are barely out of court these days and are constantly having to raise funds to do with one action or another. Some of it vexatious at the hands of trans activists and men who just don't like hearing women say no to them. On other occasions, there has been extreme police overreach. People have been arrested and lost their jobs for their views in questioning the agenda. Men and women have received visits from police for the crime of protecting women and children. Some people were cautioned, some were prosecuted. It was interesting that the very first footage I had ever recorded for what was going to be the trans doc was with Miranda Yardley, a long-term, fairly well-known public transsexual. And Miranda was in court accused of the UK's first trans hate crime. And it was interesting because it was a straight woman working for Mermaids who was part of the criminal charge against Miranda. And I couldn't quite get over the irony of a straight woman claiming her son was female and seeking a prosecution against an actual transsexual male. In court, the judge listened, both sides, and then dismissed the case, realised there wasn't a case to answer to.
Yeah, it was a pretty grim experience having to go through all of that time to be able to, you know, in essence, have this utterly vexatious and meaningless case thrown out because there just was no evidence. It was embarrassing seeing the CPS trying to defend it.
Here is former police officer Harry Miller explaining why he and like-minded others formed the campaign group We Are Fair Cop.
So, We Are Fair Cop. Fair Cop is not just about me. I'm just one of a number of people who have had this sort of ridiculous persecution by the police for non-crimes, and that's the reason that we've set up Fair Cop, because we are absolutely determined to combat this absolute crap pile that the police are running with. Not just the police, the judiciary, the CPS, the politicians, the whole damn lot of them. And we are standing up and saying, no, you're not doing that. There's now Fair Cop, and we're going to put a stop to it.
Harry Miller had found himself on the sharp end of the law following speaking out on social media and being questioned about his thoughts by police. Harry eventually took it to the High Court and experienced something of a victory. Here's what he had to say.
Miller versus homicide serves as a rallying cry. Women, comedians, students, even politicians, rediscover what it's like to think. Then go forth and tweet without fear. But this judgment also serves as a chilling effect on the police. If you act as Big Brother on behalf of rainbow warriors and the grievance mobs, beware. Fair Cop is watching you.
And he continues, last year, a transgender British cop was removed from duty for actions towards both myself and Harry. Harry Miller has now handed over the reins of We Are Fair Cop to lawyer Sarah Phillimore. He's done a phenomenal job and the UK should thank him for the pushback he was prepared to do on behalf of women, children, and gay and lesbian people. Slowly, though, things began to change and a number of cases and legal claims have shaped the pushback narrative. These include Maya Forstater, who suffered employment penalties for voicing her opposition and ultimately proved that her trans views are worthy of respect in a democratic society. It was Forstater's case that fully activated Harry Potter author JK Rowling to be a TERF. And I think probably most people have now heard about JK Rowling speaking out about transgenderism and how it impacts women. So A TERF, if you are not familiar, stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminist. I was called a TERF, even though I've never claimed to be either exclusionary or a feminist, but it's basic shorthand for anyone, primarily female, who refuse to accept the trans doctrine that people are born in the wrong body and that men who say they are women must be permitted immediate and unquestioning entry to women's spaces. The cowardice of politicians has been extraordinary. A mere smattering from different political parties were prepared to speak out. There was David Davies, a Conservative MP at the time. I went to visit him in Parliament.
And it's been made very clear to me that my speaking out on this issue has had an impact on what I can do in politics. I'm not going to put it any further than that, but that is the case. This is probably the most powerful lobby group I've ever come across in 20 years.
Then there was Lord Lewis Mooney.
I was asked by Posey Parker and Venice Allen if I would host a meeting to look at medical and other effects of the transition process, particularly adverse effects on children and adolescents. We managed to get a very high quality panel of speakers, medical, scientific, psychological speakers, plus very strong activists. And I decided I'd book it and the meeting would go ahead. I couldn't really find another peer to support it. I did ask one who can remain anonymous, but she found out what it was and hurriedly withdrew. But that's a common attitude in politics about this trans issue. They've all bought into this daft agenda and don't seem to be able to get out of it. Anyway, I decided the meeting would go ahead, fixed it all up, and the weekend before I was contacted by the Chief Whip, Tom McAvoy, who's a very old friend, who asked to speak to me, and I spoke to him on the Monday. Meeting was due, I think, on the Wednesday. Tuesday, Wednesday, can't remember. Wednesday. The meeting was due on the Wednesday, and he basically asked me, "Can you not cancel this meeting? It's embarrassing for the party, and there's a lot of people objecting to it." I said, "Sorry, Tommy, no way. You know, I've invited people to come in. We've been to a great deal of trouble and a great deal of expense in getting a good panel of speakers. This is a meeting which will go ahead, whether the party likes it or not." The following, I was supposed to then see him when I came down to Parliament the following day. There was a meeting provisionally arranged, I had to arrange it. I was then texted to say that the meeting now wouldn't take place, and almost immediately afterwards I got a message from the Labour Party saying that I was going to be asked to come before a committee of inquiry into my behaviour on social media. A curious coincidence that it happened a day after I'd refused to desist from the meeting that I'd promised to hold.
Meeting, it should be pointed out, was about doing no harm to children. It's astonishing what was going on in the background to try and pull that meeting in the first place. Nonetheless, it went ahead and there were some brilliant people there.
It's had to happen in secret places, which is utterly bizarre. Utterly bizarre.
I understand exactly what you mean, because it's almost like something has been penetrated
I think
today.
so.
I feel that.
I think so. I think something is happening. I know from when I first began to research and talk about this, I was absolutely shut down almost immediately. Of course, interestingly, I was shut down within the Women's Equality Party, where I thought it was very pertinent that what was happening to women and children should be discussed. And from that period of time, over the past 2 years, it's become more and more possible to talk about this in a public forum. Of course, we're still silenced. It's still a very difficult topic, because there are many people who didn't come today to that, MPs and Lords, and I know there are people who are sympathetic, but even in our Houses of Parliament, We have people afraid to be associated with the ethical concern for the medicalisation of children.
And yet, this has the establishment absolutely terrified. We've just been to a meeting in the House of Lords in a committee room where hardly any MPs or Lords attended. I think there were 3 in that room. It's
sort of speaks for itself, doesn't it?
It speaks for itself. It is extraordinary.
We were up against politicians competing to be the best ally. In the following years, politicians from all parties would tie themselves in knots, trying not to say what a woman actually was when asked by media. Oddly, it was the Tories, and in particular, short-time PM Liz Truss and Boris Johnson, who provided the greatest political pushback. Labour was largely a lost cause. They stuffed their women-only shortlist with males, and both Jeremy Corbyn and Angela Rayner threw their all into supporting a young male who was replacing females. Many of the Labour men and women appeared to have lost the plot, unable to tell those who were asking what a woman was, and some of the MPs, including Dawn Butler and now Culture Secretary Lisa Nandy, made absurd statements about biology and their mutual inability to remember even the most basic understanding of the differences between males and females. But they were all compromised. Many Labour supporters had bought into the Marxist agenda of transgenderism, and the cowardice politicians ran along with it in fear of losing their spot. The other thing, and this is so important, is often overlooked, but the power of their very existence is a source of consternation for many trans activists, is the detransitioners. I spoke with Ben Dyke, a Canadian. Ben transitioned to a boy at 15 and retransitioned to a girl at 19. This is not as unusual as it sounds. Keira Bell is another example of that. The Keira Bell judgment was a victory for the protection of children. There were media voices weeping and wailing about Keira standing up for her rights and how she had been impacted.
It's massively important that we understand detransitioning and that we don't deny that it's happening. Trans activists are terrified of acknowledging that it happens. We don't really know how much it happens because people get shamed. My patient that I talk about got shamed by the trans community and vilified, and he had to pretend that the blog that he put up about his experiences was actually a lie, and they wouldn't leave him alone until he'd done that.
The unquestioning acceptance that trans ideology is fact and it's being taught to children is definitely furthering society's unquestionable acceptance that transition is the cure to dysphoria. And detransitioners are the living proof that that's not always the case.
In the last 6 years, I am pleased to say much has changed. None of this would have been possible without the pushback from the activists. Absolutely none of it. It was all these organizations were captured and they were running along with it, and politicians were backing it, and all big organizations were under the spell of Stonewall and Mermaids. But in the last 6 years, much has changed. Mermaids has been under investigation. Tavistock was under investigation and is now shut down. We learnt absolutely that this was very Orwellian. As George Orwell said, the party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final, most essential command. And England said no. Thank you for being here today. I very much appreciate having you with me. And thank you to everybody I have included in this report. As I say, there are many other voices that I simply was not able to include, but I want to thank them deeply for informing me. This is a fight that continues. Just because people who believe in biology manage to have the upper hand in England, it doesn't mean that trans activists aren't busy working away behind the scenes, trying to take us back to dark days when transgenderism was running the UK.